Welcome everyone to another deep dive. Before we even take our first step today, I have a really special, um, incredibly joyful shout out to make.
Oh, yeah, we have a new friend joining us.
We do. Sister Charmaine, living over in Southeast England, is joining our discussions for the very first time. Welcome, Sister Charmaine.
Yes, welcome, Sister Charmaine. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here with us.
We really are. And to you, our listener, whether you're sitting in your living room or commuting or just taking a quiet walk, we are so glad you are right here in the room with us. Today, we are exploring a deeply personal and profound question. The title of today's deep dive is, What Does My Grace is Sufficient mean?
It is, it's one of the most comforting yet probably frequently misunderstood promises out there.
Exactly, which is exactly why right here at the start, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. We are going to be asking and answering the exact question. What does my grace is sufficient mean?
Because that phrase has echoed through centuries. I mean, it offers a lifeline to people in their absolute darkest moments.
Yeah.
But the true depth of it sort of gets lost in translation or smoothed over by religious tradition.
Yeah, smoothed over is a good way to put it. Now, looking around this virtual room, our audience today is a truly wonderful mix. We have Bible newcomers who might be hearing these ancient phrases for the very first time.
Which is great.
Right, and we also have mature Bible believers who have been walking this path for decades.
And because of that beautiful mix, we are going to set a very specific intention for our time today. This deep dive is going to be deliberately easy, completely unrushed.
No ticking clock.
Exactly, no ticking clock. We are deeply reflective today. We aren't here to sprint through a dense theological textbook or talk over anyone's head. Our goal is to explain the beautiful foundational basics of this promise for those who are brand new to it.
But we're also going to layer in some deep dive historical context and linguistic explanations for our mature readers who want to dig a little deeper. I really appreciate that approach. Unrushed is exactly what we need. So let's lay out the roadmap so you know exactly what you are going to learn today. First, we are going to uncover the true story of the Apostle Paul and his highly debated, mysterious thorn in the flesh.
Second, we'll share some simple, incredibly powerful story-type illustrations that explain how God's grace practically works in our messy everyday lives.
Third, we're going to wade into the deep Greek origins of the words grace and sufficient to see what they originally meant,
before modern language watered them down. And fourth, we will take some time to dismantle a few common myths and religious traditions that have clouded the true meaning of grace.
And finally, we will look at real-life Bible stories of ordinary people who experienced this sustaining power firsthand.
It is a comprehensive roadmap. And to begin, we really need to set the stage properly. We need to step back in time, back to the dusty roads of the ancient Mediterranean world.
To meet a man dealing with a crushing burden.
Yes, to meet the Apostle Paul.
For our newcomers, let's just paint a quick picture of who the Apostle Paul was. He is a monumental figure. I mean, he wrote a massive chunk of the New Testament.
If you picture early Christianity, you almost certainly picture Paul.
Right. He was traveling relentlessly, starting churches in hostile territories, writing these brilliant, philosophically dense letters. From the outside looking in, he seems like the ultimate success story of the early faith.
But in the midst of all this public success, he was going through a terribly difficult private agony.
He had a problem that he described as a thorn in the flesh. And the text tells us that he was in such distress over this that he begged God 3 times to remove it. He didn't just casually ask.
No, he pleaded.
He pleaded.
And that is the crucial tension of the story right there. Here is a man who has seen miracles. He has been an instrument of divine healing for other people. And yet when he pleads with God for his own relief, we encounter a profound twist in the narrative.
Because we expect a miracle.
Right in the biblical record, when someone of Paul's stature pleads with God, we modern readers almost always expect a dramatic deliverance. But God's answer to Paul wasn't a yes. God actually refused to remove the thorn.
Which is wild.
Instead, God gave him the promise found in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. The promise was this: my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.
Wait, let me just pause you right there. That is almost shocking when you really think about it. A definitive no to healing or relief.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, hearing that today, it sounds like God is brushing him off. Like, I'm not going to fix your problem, but here's some grace instead. It can feel a little hollow if you don't understand what is actually being offered.
It really can.
So what does this divine response actually mean for someone hearing it today who is in the middle of their own painful situation.
That is the natural human reaction to a no from the divine.
Yeah.
We interpret it as abandonment or
Yeah.
indifference. But what is fascinating here is the why behind that response.
Yeah.
In the biblical narrative, a no from God is rarely an absence of an answer. It is a definitive redirection. God was essentially telling Paul that I am not going to remove the problem, because removing the problem would remove the very mechanism that is keeping you connected to my power.
Wow.
But I am going to provide you with the exact, precise strength you need to undo it. The divine response introduces a specific economy of strength. It operates on the principle of replacement rather than supplementation.
What do you mean by supplementation?
God isn't offering to top up Paul's own natural strength. God is saying that his divine strength will be at its absolute best, its most visible, when Paul realizes he is at his absolute weakest.
That concept can still feel a little abstract, so let's bring it down to earth. I think the best way to understand this is through a picture that any parent, or really anyone who has spent time trying to teach a young child, will instantly recognize. Let's call it the father and the learning child.
I love this one.
Imagine a young kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, trying to tie their shoes for the very first time. They are sitting on the floor struggling. Their little fingers just cannot seem to coordinate to make the loops, cross them over, and pull the laces tight.
Right, and they get frustrated.
So frustrated, their face gets red. They look up at their father and they ask, "Daddy, please do it for me."
And the father, being capable and strong and entirely familiar with how to tie a shoe, could simply reach down, tie those laces in about 3 seconds, and solve the immediate problem.
The thorn would be removed.
The child's frustration would be over instantly.
Exactly. But if the father always did that, if he always removed the struggle the second it got hard, the child would never learn the necessary skill. It would remove the temporary frustration, but it would also sabotage the long-term growth.
So instead, the loving father kneels down, gets right in the middle of the mess with the child, puts his big, strong hands right over the child's tiny, trembling hands, and says, "It's okay. Let's do it together."
My hands will guide yours.
Yes. The father doesn't take the struggle away. The child still has to go through the difficult motions. But the father gives his strength, his presence, and his guidance so the child can succeed.
This is a beautiful, tangible picture of God's grace being sufficient. He doesn't always magically remove our thorns, but he puts his strong hand over our weak, tired ones and gives us the strength to persevere. His presence is right there in the middle of the struggle.
And that shifts the entire focus of the believer's prayer life. It moves the focus from the desperate removal of the problem to the calming presence of the provider. Let us build on that with a second illustration, the anchor in the storm.
Okay, paint that picture for us.
Imagine a small wooden boat caught in a violent, terrifying storm far out at sea. The sensory reality of this is overwhelming. The waves are enormous, crashing violently over the sides of the boat. The wind is howling so loudly the sailor can barely hear himself think.
Sounds terrifying.
The sailor is clinging to the mast and prays desperately, "Lord, please stop the storm, make the water calm, command the wind to cease."
Which honestly is the exact prayer I would be praying. Fix the environment so I can feel safe again. Stop the chaos.
It is the most natural human instinct. But in this scenario, the storm continues to rage. The dark clouds remain. The rain continues to lash down. The circumstances do not change one bit.
So God said no to the storm stopping.
Exactly. However, the sailor then looks over the side of the boat and notices something vital that he had forgotten in his panic. A strong, thick, heavy steel anchor chain. He follows that chain down into the dark, churning water and realizes his little boat is securely attached to the very bedrock of the ocean floor. He isn't drifting aimlessly toward the jagged rocks. He is held firm.
That changes everything.
If we connect this to the broader biblical concept we were discussing, God's grace is that anchor. It does not always calm the storms of life. The physical illness might still be ravaging the body.
Right.
The deep grief of losing a loved one might still ache every morning. The terrifying financial trouble might still be looming over your head. But when the storm is at its absolute worst, grace is the invisible, unbreakable power that holds you steady.
It gives a deep, unshakable peace that simply does not make sense to the watching world.
It is the promise that you will not be destroyed no matter how hard the wind blows.
I love that imagery of the anchor holding you steady when everything else is chaos. Because sometimes survival is the miracle. Let's add one more illustration for clarity. The sun breaking through the clouds.
A classic experience.
We have all experienced a long, gray, miserable week of rainy weather. Everything feels dark, damp, and heavy. You
Oh.
might even start to feel a little hopeless or incredibly tired just from the lack of light. But then, just for a moment, the thick clouds part and the sun breaks through.
But analyze the physical reality of that moment. The weather system hasn't actually disappeared.
No.
The heavy clouds are still present all around. The rain might even still be falling lightly from the edges of those clouds.
Yes, the storm hasn't completely left, but in that instant, the golden light and the physical warmth hit your face, and your entire psychological experience of the day changes.
The world suddenly looks brighter.
Your mood lifts.
Yeah.
You feel a sense of hope. Paul's thorn was like that dark, heavy cloud that just absolutely refused to go away. God's grace was the powerful, warm sun breaking through that cloud.
The pain, the problem, the difficulty, they remained. But God's presence and his power changed everything about how Paul experienced that pain.
He was no longer just suffering alone in the dark, feeling abandoned. He was suffering in the warm light of God's love and purpose.
These illustrations really distill a profound theological truth into something we can grasp. When the text says, "My grace is sufficient," it is making a direct promise to the believer. It is saying, "I see your pain. I am not ignorant of it.
I am not going to leave you to handle it alone.
And my infinite strength will be made perfect in your specific area of weakness." It relieves you of the exhausting, crushing burden of having to be strong enough on your own.
It is such a relief to know you don't have to white-knuckle your way through life. So we've looked at the basics. Now let's wade into the deep dive portion.
Let's do it.
Let's look at the historical context for the mature believer who wants to understand the world Paul was actually living in, the crucible of Corinth. What was actually happening on the ground when Paul sat down and wrote these words?
To truly grasp the weight of this promise, we have to inhabit the crisis Paul was facing. He wrote this in his second letter to the Corinthian church. Now, Corinth was a wealthy, bustling, highly competitive city.
Like a major hub?
Very much so. At this time, the congregation there was being heavily influenced by individuals. The biblical text sarcastically refers to as super apostles.
Super apostles? That sounds so arrogant.
It was. These were itinerant religious teachers who were incredibly charismatic. They boasted loudly about their brilliant speaking skills, their flawless religious pedigrees, their letters of recommendation, and their spectacular, undeniable, miraculous experiences.
So they were putting on a show?
A massive show. And their entire agenda was to completely undermine Paul's authority by making him look weak, physically unimpressive, and spiritually inferior by comparison.
It sounds remarkably modern. It's like the ancient version of social media influencers showing off their highly curated, perfectly filtered lives.
With massive follower count.
Exactly, just flawless success to make everyone else feel inadequate.
So how does Paul respond to this? Does he pull out his own resume of strengths? Does he list all the churches he planted to compete with them?
He does something entirely countercultural. It is a brilliant, disarming response. Instead of boasting of his strengths to match their arrogance, Paul deliberately boasts of his infirmities, his insults, his hardships, and his persecutions.
Turning their whole argument upside down.
Precisely, but he does mention one extraordinary thing, just to prove a point. He casually mentions that 14 years prior, he had a profound, unparalleled spiritual experience where he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words that a man is not permitted to speak.
Okay, that is a massive claim. Huge. Now, a visionary experience of that magnitude carries an incredibly high risk of producing massive, intoxicating spiritual pride.
Oh, for sure. You'd think you were the most special person on earth.
Right. So to mitigate that conceit, to keep him permanently tethered to the ground, Paul explains that this thorn in the flesh was given to him. He specifically calls it a messenger of Satan to buffet me.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting, and it's a question I think absolutely everyone asks when they read this passage. So what exactly was this thorn? Do we have any historical or medical idea of what he was dealing with?
This brings us to a fascinating taxonomic study of the interpretations. Before we look at the theories, we must look at the original Greek vocabulary. The word Paul uses for thorn is skolops.
Skolops.
Yes. Now, when an English speaker hears thorn, we almost always think of a tiny, prickly little thing on the stem of a rose bush. A minor annoyance.
Something you pull out with tweezers, like a splinter you get from a wooden banister. Annoying, but not life-altering.
Exactly. But skolops does not mean a tiny prick. In classical Greek, it means a sharpened wooden stake, the kind used for impaling, or a massive agonizing splinter of wood.
Oh, wow.
And the word he uses for buffet is kolophizo.
Kolophizo? That sounds harsh just saying it.
It is. It literally means being struck violently with a closed fist or being beaten.
So when Paul says a thorn in the flesh to buffet me, This was not a minor inconvenience or a bad day.
No, not at all.
It was a brutal, agonizing, deeply physical or psychological reality that felt like being beaten with a sharpened stake.
A sharpened stick in the flesh. That changes the picture entirely. It elevates the level of suffering we were talking about.
It really does. So what are the actual theories? Because the text frustratingly doesn't explicitly name the medical condition or the exact problem.
Historical and theological research over the centuries has categorized the theories into four main areas. The first category is physical maladies.
Okay, physical sickness.
Right. Many ancient and modern scholars suggest Paul suffered from chronic ophthalmia, which are severe, weeping, painful eye problems.
And is there evidence for that in his other writings?
Yes, this theory is heavily supported by his letter to the Galatians. In that letter, he mentions that the church loved him so much they would have been willing to pluck out their own eyes and give them to him.
Oh, wow. Why use that specific strange phrase unless his eyes were the source of his agony?
Exactly. What else falls under the physical category? Other physical theories include recurring bouts of ancient malaria, which was incredibly common in the swampy coastal regions he frequently traveled.
And malaria comes and goes, right?
Yes, it causes violent fevers, chills, and agonizing joint pain that comes and goes, which perfectly matches the recurring buffeting description. Others suggest epilepsy or severe debilitating migraines. Furthermore, Paul's critics in Corinth explicitly described his bodily presence as weak and his speech as contemptible, which points to a physical frailty.
So it very well could have been a debilitating chronic physical sickness that made him look weak to the outside world. What is the second theory?
The second category involves external persecution. Some theologians believe the messenger of Satan refers to an actual antagonistic person or a specific group of people.
Like actual enemies.
Yes. Paul faced relentless, violent opposition everywhere he went. He was hunted by hostile religious leaders, undermined by the super-apostles we just discussed, and betrayed by individuals like Alexander the coppersmith, who Paul said did him great harm.
And the terminology fits.
Interestingly, in the Old Testament, specifically in Numbers 33:55 and Joshua 23:13, the word thorns is used metaphorically to describe hostile inhabitants of a land who cause constant trouble.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here. If it's just a person bothering him, why would he pray 3 times for it to be removed? Couldn't he just travel somewhere else?
Because the opposition wasn't localized, it followed him. Imagine spending your life building something beautiful, a community, a church, and having a dedicated group of saboteurs constantly tearing it down, spreading lies about you and physically assaulting you.
That would be brutal.
That constant draining conflict with people who are actively trying to destroy your life's work could certainly feel like a stake in the flesh.
Point taken. That would be exhausting. What's the third category?
The third is mental or spiritual struggles. This theory posits that Paul suffered from recurring severe depression, intense anxiety, or a persistent agonizing temptation.
Oh, that's it.
He uses words like torment and harassment to describe the thorn's function. In the Greek world, those terms are very frequently associated with deep psychological or spiritual battles.
Like a severe dark night of the soul that just kept coming back. Someone dealing with clinical depression or intrusive thoughts today could deeply relate to praying 3 times for the darkness to lift.
Absolutely. And the fourth theory, the fourth is what we might call systemic struggles or profound vocational burnout.
Burnout.
If you read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul lists a staggering, almost unbelievable litany of sufferings. He mentions multiple shipwrecks, being beaten with rods, being stoned and left for dead, countless imprisonments, sleepless nights, and starvation.
It's a miracle he survived at all.
And then, at the end of that list, he adds what might be the heaviest burden of all: the daily pressure of concern for all the churches.
The emotional toll.
Yes, the sheer systemic weight of his calling, the emotional toll of carrying the burdens of thousands of people, could have constituted a stake in the side of any human leader.
So we have chronic physical illness, relentless hostile people, crushing mental anguish or systemic exhaustion and burnout. We don't know which one it was, but here is the million-dollar question.
I know what you're going to ask.
Why is it actually a good thing that we don't know exactly what Paul's thorn was? Because as a reader, I want to know the answer.
It is entirely natural to want the historical fact, but this raises a profoundly important theological insight. The silence of the biblical text regarding the specific nature of the thorn is widely considered by scholars to be a providential omission.
Providential omission,
Yeah.
meaning God left it out on purpose.
Think about the implications. If the biblical text explicitly stated that Paul's thorn was ancient malaria, then a modern person suffering from the deep grief of a lost child, or facing total financial ruin might read that passage and say, well, God's grace is sufficient for physical fevers like malaria, but it clearly doesn't apply to my specific emotional or financial problem.
Wow, that is so true. We would completely exclude ourselves from the promise.
Exactly.
Mhm.
By deliberately leaving the thorn as a mystery, the promise remains universally applicable. Its mystery is exactly what makes it directly applicable to whatever your thorn is in your life right now.
That is an incredible way to look at it. The blank space in the ancient text is deliberately left there so you, the reader, thousands of years later, can write your own specific struggle into it. God's grace covers it all.
Yes, it does.
So let's pivot and dive into the actual mechanics of this grace and sufficiency. We throw the word grace around all the time in modern culture. We talk about a graceful dancer or giving someone a grace period on their rent. But what does it really mean in this context?
To understand the spiritual mechanics, we have to look past our modern English usage and examine the etymology of the word itself. In the New Testament Greek, the word used is charis.
Charis. And how would you define charis for someone who has never studied ancient Greek?
Charis is best understood as a one-way gift or unmerited favor. In our normal modern world, almost everything operates on a two-way transactional street.
Right, I give you something, you give me something.
You work a difficult job for 40 hours, you earn a paycheck, you study late into the night, you earn a high grade, you are kind to a friend, you expect kindness in return.
It's basically karma or just basic fairness. Although I know we don't use the word karma here, we just mean getting what you deserve.
Exactly. But charis is the exact opposite of that system. It is a gift given to you when you absolutely have not earned it, cannot repay it, and fundamentally do not deserve it.
And I imagine that is a very hard concept for the human brain to accept because we are so wired for transactions.
Precisely. And theological research identifies three distinct manifestations of this charis in a person's life, which helps clarify how it functions.
What's the first one?
First, there is saving grace. This is the initial miraculous provision by which a spiritually dead person is reconciled to God entirely through faith in Christ. It is the unearned gift of total forgiveness and eternal life.
Okay, that makes sense. The starting point.
Second, there is sustaining grace. This is the ongoing daily power that enables a believer to survive intense pain, fulfill their calling, and maintain their security in God amidst the trials of life. It's exactly what Paul was experiencing with his thorn.
And the third?
And third, there is common grace. These are the universal blessings bestowed upon all of humanity. Things like the warmth of the sun, the rain that waters the crops, the beauty of a mountain range, and the general order of human society. These are given generously by God regardless of a person's spiritual status or morality.
A really helpful way to remember the core of this, and I think I learned this years ago, is the acronym GRACE. G-R-A-C-E. God's riches at Christ's expense.
That is a classic way to remember it.
It means that all the limitless wealth of God's love, forgiveness, and sustaining power is given to us freely, solely because the agonizing cost was already fully paid by Jesus on the cross. It's a staggering thought when you really dwell on it.
It is the bedrock of the entire Christian faith, and it pairs perfectly with the second crucial word in the promise we are examining, sufficient.
Sufficient. What's the Greek for that?
The original Greek word here is archeo. When we examine archeo, we find it means to be possessed of unfailing strength, or to have a provision that fully meets a specific need.
Fully meets a specific need.
It does not imply a luxurious excess. Rather, it implies a quantity that is perfectly divinely calibrated to the exact demand of the moment. It is a state of just enoughness.
Just enoughness. I love that phrase, but I can also see how that might be frustrating. We usually want more than enough. We want a massive surplus so we feel secure.
That is human nature. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of the biblical narrative, it functions exactly like the manna that God provided to the Israelites when they were wandering in the harsh wilderness.
Oh, the bread from heaven.
God gave them miraculous bread from heaven every morning, but He gave them only enough for one single day. If they tried to hoard it, if they tried to build up a massive surplus in their tents so they wouldn't have to rely on God the next day, the text says the manna would breed worms and rot.
Right. You can't put grace in a spiritual refrigerator. You can't store it in a closet so that you can finally say, okay, I have enough grace stockpiled now. I don't need to pray or rely on God anymore.
Exactly. Sufficiency does not imply a massive static surplus that allows for independent autonomous operation. It is a dynamic, breath-by-breath provision.
Breath by breath.
It's designed this way on purpose.
Yeah.
Because this just enoughness is the very mechanism that keeps you intimately connected to the source of the grace. It forces you to rely on God today and then wake up completely empty and rely on Him all over again tomorrow.
It builds an intimate, ongoing relationship rather than just handing out a one-time transaction.
That is exactly the point.
So good. Now, by the way, as we are diving into these really deep concepts of grace and sufficiency, I just want to pause organically and mention something. If you are finding this deep dive helpful, or if you know a friend, a family member, or perhaps a coworker who is currently dealing with a heavy thorn of their own, someone who might really need this specific encouragement today, please take a second to share this audio with them.
Yes, please do.
And if you are enjoying this journey of discovery with us, please make sure to subscribe to the show so we can continue exploring the pure Word of God together every time we release a new discussion. We love having this community grow.
It is a joy to share this.
It really is. So returning to our discussion, this is all so rich and there's still so much more to uncover about how this power actually works in our weaknesses. To fully appreciate what grace is, we sometimes have to clear away the thick brush of what it is not.
That is a vital step.
For a newcomer, and frankly, even for people who have been in church their whole lives, the concept of grace is often heavily shrouded in rigid religious traditions and doctrinal myths that completely obscure its true liberating meaning.
That is a very important pivot. We must systematically clear away those myths to see the pure doctrine.
Well, let's unpack these myths one by one. Myth number one, the myth of leniency.
Ah, yes.
This is the widespread cultural idea that grace means God is just sort of chilled out or sweet or maybe even a little wimpy when it comes to human sin. Like He looks down from heaven, winks at our destructive mistakes and says, "Oh, boys will be boys. Nobody's perfect. Come on in."
That is a fundamental and dangerous misunderstanding. Grace is never to be confused with mere leniency or moral apathy.
They aren't the same thing at all.
No. True biblical grace is deeply, inextricably rooted in the unflinching, terrifying justice of the cross. Grace teaches that God will not and inherently cannot compromise His perfect holiness simply to make a superficial, easy peace with humanity.
So how does grace work then?
Instead, the rigorous, exact reality of grace is that God paid the agonizing, lethal debt of holiness Himself. It is not God lazily ignoring sin. It is God absorbing the catastrophic cost of it in His own body.
That is a massive distinction. Grace isn't cheap. It was incredibly costly. That leads right into the second myth, which is closely related, the myth of the lowered bar.
Let's hear it.
This is the assumption that because we are no longer under strict religious law, but under grace, God has lowered the standard of what He expects from us.
This myth suggests that grace is a divine excuse for perpetual mediocrity. But in reality, grace does not replace the law's high standard of holiness. Rather, it provides the internal power to actually meet it.
How so?
If you look at the book of Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, it explicitly states that the grace of God trains us to renounce ungodliness and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. Grace is an active, militant training force, not a pass to lower the bar of behavior.
But let me push back on that for a second. Isn't that exhausting? If the bar isn't lowered, how is that good news for someone who is already burned out from trying to be a good person?
It is good news because the source of the effort has changed.
The source.
Yes. The law demands that you climb the mountain using your own frail muscles. Grace does not shrink the mountain. The mountain remains just as high. But grace provides the divine strength to climb it. It is the power working within you, not just a demand placed upon you.
Ah, I see. It's the strength to climb, not an elevator that skips the mountain entirely.
Exactly.
Let's look at myth number 3, the myth of earned grace. This one is so incredibly sneaky because it appeals directly to our human pride.
It really does.
It's the legalistic belief that we have to do our part to trigger God's favor, or that our intense faith or our good deeds are essentially a work we perform to secure the grace.
As we discussed earlier, the human mind desperately wants to turn everything into a transaction. We want to feel we have contributed to our own salvation, even if it's just a tiny percentage.
We want to be able to boast.
Exactly. But the biblical text is unyielding and absolute on this point. Grace is freely given, completely and totally independent of anything we have done, are doing, or could ever do in the future. If it can be earned even a fraction of a percent, the Apostle Paul argues in Romans that it ceases to be grace entirely.
And the flip side of that is myth number 4, the myth of a license to sin.
The other ditch.
Right. Some people hear that grace is free unearned and covers all mistakes, and they logically conclude, great. Since grace abounds where sin increases, I can just live however I want, sin as much as I want, and God is contractually obligated to forgive me.
This is a devastating distortion. What the ancient scriptures describe as turning the grace of God into lewdness or a license for immorality. True grace doesn't just change your legal standing in a heavenly courtroom. It radically fundamentally transforms your internal heart.
It changes what you want.
It changes your deepest desires. The best analogy is a healthy, deeply loving marriage. When you are profoundly loved, valued, and completely secure in a marriage, that ironclad security doesn't make you want to go out and be unfaithful.
No, of course not. It doesn't make you say my spouse loves me unconditionally, therefore I can cheat on them. No, the profound unearned love you receive makes you intensely want to be faithful. True grace creates a new heart that desperately wants to belong to God and please Him, not exploit Him.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. The unearned love actually changes the core desire. And finally, let's hit myth number 5, the myth of gratitude-powered obedience.
This is a subtle one.
It is. This is the idea that we obey God simply out of a heavy sense of obligation or profound gratitude for what He did for us in the past on the cross. We think He died for me, so now I owe Him a lifetime of good behavior.
While gratitude is certainly a beautiful natural fruit of experiencing grace, it is entirely insufficient as the primary power source for lifelong obedience.
It runs out.
It absolutely runs out. If you rely solely on your own subjective feelings of gratitude, you will eventually burn out because human gratitude fluctuates. Some days you feel it, some days you don't.
So what's the alternative? The true power for obedience is the present tense active life of Christ dwelling within the believer through the Holy Spirit. Grace is not just the ancient receipt proving you purchased the car. Grace is the actual highly combustible fuel in the tank for the ongoing daily journey. It is a present, active, sustaining power.
Fuel in the tank, not just a receipt in the glove box. Love that. So we've successfully cleared away the myths. We know what grace actually is and what it definitely isn't. Now we arrive at the very heart of Paul's revelation in 2 Corinthians.
A paradox.
The absolute paradox of power, the idea that when we are weak, then we are strong.
This statement, "My power is made perfect in weakness," sounds like an unsolvable riddle at first glance. How can divine strength possibly be perfected or fully realized in human frailty?
It goes against everything we are taught in our culture.
It does. But it is arguably one of the most freeing, revolutionary truths in the entire biblical narrative. Paul realized that his moments of greatest, most agonizing struggle, his physical pain, his anxiety, his persecutions, they were not tragic obstacles preventing God's work.
They weren't roadblocks.
No, they were in fact the precise ordained opportunities for God's power to be put on spectacular display.
He learned to actually boast in his weaknesses, which is wild. Let's explain this concept using something Paul himself wrote about, the concept of the clay jars.
In 2 Corinthians chapter 4.
Yes, verse 7, Paul says we are like ancient clay jars. Now, in the ancient Mediterranean world, clay jars were cheap, ubiquitous, common, and incredibly fragile. They broke easily.
Use them for everyday chores.
Right. They weren't intrinsically valuable like ornate gold or polished silver vessels.
And yet the brilliant secret of the gospel is that God deliberately chooses to place His absolute greatest treasure, His divine power, His eternal light, His Holy Spirit inside these fragile, easily broken, entirely common clay jars.
He skips the gold entirely.
He deliberately bypasses the gold and silver vessels. This raises an incredibly important question. Why would a king put treasure in a cheap, cracked pot?
And what's the answer?
The biblical text gives the explicit answer, so that when extraordinary, beautiful, miraculous things happen through us, it is overwhelmingly obvious to everyone watching that the surpassing power belongs exclusively to God and does not originate from our own human excellence.
Let's illustrate this paradox with a few powerful, memorable stories, because sometimes a story bypasses the brain and hits the heart directly. The first one is an old folk tale, and it's a favorite of mine, the cracked pot.
Oh, I know this one. It's beautiful.
Imagine a humble water carrier in an ancient, dusty village. Every single day, he carries 2 large clay pots hanging from the ends of a heavy wooden pole resting across his shoulders. He walks down to the river, fills them, and walks back to his master's house.
The daily routine.
Now, one pot is absolutely perfect. It is flawless. It always delivers a full, complete portion of water to the master's house. The other pot, however, has a noticeable deep crack in its side. By the time the water carrier completes the long, hot walk from the river to the house, the cracked pot has leaked a steady stream of water and arrives only half full.
You can imagine the psychological weight of that if we personify the pots.
Definitely.
For years, the perfect pot is proud of its accomplishments. But the cracked pot feels a deep, abiding, agonizing sense of shame regarding its weakness. It views itself as a total failure, fundamentally flawed and incapable of fulfilling its intended purpose. It assumes the master is disappointed.
It's carrying so much guilt.
Finally, unable to bear the shame any longer, the cracked pot speaks to the carrier and apologizes. "I am so incredibly sorry," it says. "My crack makes me useless. I leak everywhere. I can only do half my job. You should replace me with a better pot."
I think so many of us feel exactly like that cracked pot. But listen to what the carrier says. He smiles gently at the pot. He doesn't scold it. He says, "Did you happen to notice the beautiful, vibrant flowers growing on your side of the dirt path as we walked today?
The flowers.
Did you notice there are no flowers on the perfect pot side? I knew about your crack all along. I knew your weakness before I even chose you, so I deliberately planted flower seeds on your side of the path.
It is so profound.
Every single day as we walk back from the river, your leaking water, your supposed failure, nourishes those seeds. Because of your weakness, I've been able to pick fresh, beautiful flowers to decorate my master's table every single day. Without your crack, this beauty would not exist in the world."
The theological explanation here is that our human weaknesses, our physical limitations, our emotional scars, they are not merely problems to be eradicated or hidden away in shame. They are often the exact, divinely ordained fissures through which God's life-giving water flows out of us to bring beauty, grace, and blessing to a dry world that desperately needs it. God does not just tolerate our cracks, He actively uses them.
That gives so much dignity to the parts of ourselves we usually want to hide. It completely reframes how we view our own inadequacies. Let's look at another illustration to drive this home: the child and the heavy door.
This perfectly captures the mechanics of grace.
Think of a young child, maybe a fiercely independent toddler, walking down a city street with their father. They come to a massive, heavy, solid oak door leading into a building. The child, wanting to prove they are big and strong, runs ahead and says, "Let me open it for you, Daddy, I can do it."
And the father, understanding the physics of this situation, perfectly steps back, crosses his arms, and simply nods.
Because he knows what's going to happen.
The child leans against the massive door, pushing with all their tiny might. Their shoes slip on the pavement. Their face turns bright red. They grunt with the extreme effort. But the heavy oak door does not budge a single millimeter. It is simply factually beyond their physical capacity.
They push and push until finally the child's strength is totally exhausted. They can't fake it anymore. They let their arms drop. They look up with big, helpless, defeated eyes and whisper, "Daddy, I can't do it. It's too heavy for me."
And what happens next? Does the father mock the child? No. At that exact moment of admission, the father steps forward. He places one large, strong hand right over the child's little hands on the brass handle, and with barely any effort at all, he pushes the heavy door wide open. Together they walk through the threshold.
It's such a tender image.
If we analyze the mechanics of that moment, who actually possessed the power to open the door, the father did, but the child was graciously invited to participate in the process.
Right. They still had their hands on the handle.
However, the absolute crucial turning point of the story was the child's admission of inability. The child had to first reach the point of total failure, the point of explicitly saying, "I can't." That precise moment of confessed weakness was the exact required threshold where the father's strength could seamlessly take over.
So we have to get to the end of ourselves.
God frequently and lovingly allows us to reach the absolute end of our own emotional, financial, or physical strength so that He can step in and accomplish what only He is capable of doing. Our honest, unvarnished admission of weakness becomes the very doorway for His power to enter our circumstances.
It's all about getting our own stubborn pride out of the way, isn't it? We have to stop trying to push the door. Which leads to our third illustration, a classic story of quiet faithfulness: the hole in the dam.
Oh, the Dutch boy.
There is an old European story about a young boy living in a small village situated next to a massive, powerful river. The town is sitting below the water level, protected only by a large earthen dam. One evening, the boy is walking by and notices a tiny, dangerous hole has formed in the wall of the dam.
A disaster waiting to happen.
A small, pressurized trickle of water is pushing through. He knows the terrible reality. If that hole expands even an inch, the pressure will cause the entire dam to fail, and the violent floodwaters would wipe out his whole village while everyone sleeps.
The boy evaluates his terrifying situation. He is acutely aware of his own limitations. He is small, he is physically weak, and he possesses absolutely no engineering skills, tools, or materials to permanently repair a failing dam. He cannot stop the vast millions of gallons force of the river.
So what does he do?
But he realizes he has just enough strength to execute one simple, faithful action. He steps up and sticks his tiny finger directly into the hole.
And we have to remember this wasn't easy or glamorous. The water was freezing cold. The pressure of the river hurt his hand. His knees ached.
He had to remain kneeling there in the freezing mud all night long, shivering, exhausted, and completely alone in the pitch dark.
But his small, weak finger, placed exactly in the right spot and held there with faithful endurance, held back the flood just enough until the adults awoke and arrived in the morning to permanently repair it. The town was saved.
The theological explanation of this story is vital for anyone feeling overwhelmed by their calling. God's power is not always manifested by making us feel invincible, highly skilled, or superhuman. We don't have to be a master engineer.
Sometimes it just looks like holding on.
Sometimes. His strength is made perfect in our weakness, when we simply choose to remain faithful in a very difficult, painful, unglamorous spot. The boy's weakness was glaringly obvious. He was just a fragile, freezing child. But his act of trusting that his small, painful sacrifice mattered was the exact conduit for saving the town. God is remarkably adept at taking our small, weak, yet faithful obedience and utilizing it to accomplish mighty acts of preservation and grace.
It reminds me of the concept of the empty cup. It's a simple law of physics. You cannot fill a cup that is already full to the brim. If our lives, our minds, and our schedules are entirely filled with our own pride, our own self-sufficiency, and our stubborn, arrogant belief that we can handle every single problem on our own, we leave absolutely zero room for God's power to enter.
Because the cup is already full of us.
Exactly.
That is exactly right. Our weaknesses, our chronic physical sicknesses, our deep irrational anxieties, our emotional limitations, our financial ruin. They serve a vital divine purpose. They empty the cup.
They drain us out.
They forcefully drain away our illusion of control. And in doing so, they create the necessary hollow space for God to step in and fill us with his divine strength. The biblical record shows that God's power is not eagerly searching the earth for strong, arrogant, self-reliant people to show off through. His power is constantly searching for humble, empty, desperate people to shine brightly through.
That is the incredibly good news at the core of "My grace is sufficient for you." Let me say it clearly to you listening. You are not disqualified by your weakness. Your weakness actually makes you the perfect candidate.
A perfect vessel.
So as we move into the final section of our deep dive today, let's explore some historical analogies from great thinkers and then look at real-life Bible stories that show this sustaining grace in action. Let's start with a beautiful, somewhat humorous historical analogy from the famous 19th century British preacher, Charles Spurgeon.
He was a master of illustration.
He gave us the incredibly vivid imagery of the fish and the mouse.
Spurgeon possessed a brilliant, almost poetic ability to illustrate theological magnitude. He wanted to show how ridiculous our anxieties look when compared to God's resources. He asked his congregation to imagine the perspective of tiny, fragile creatures living in vast, overwhelming environments.
Okay, let's hear the first one.
First, he pictured a tiny little fish swimming in the massive, deep waters of the River Thames in London. He imagined this little fish becoming suddenly gripped by intense existential anxiety, thinking, I have such a terrible thirst today, and there are millions of other fish here in the river. What if I drink too much and I drink the River Thames entirely dry and we all perish?
Which is such a funny, ridiculous fear for a fish to have. The Thames is massive. It's like us looking at our bank accounts after vacation and thinking the whole global economy is going to collapse because we bought a coffee.
Exactly. But Spurgeon imagines the vast, deep river whispering back to the anxious little fish, Drink away, little fish, my stream is sufficient for thee.
And he didn't stop there, right?
He also imagined a small, hungry field mouse living inside the colossal, towering granaries of Egypt during the 7 years of unprecedented plenty under Joseph's rule. This tiny mouse is trembling in the corner, terrified that its daily eating of a few kernels might somehow consume all the grain, leaving it to starve to death in the 8th year.
Another tiny creature in a massive environment.
But Joseph, the overseer of the infinite supply, looks down at the trembling creature and says, "Cheer up, little mouse. My granaries are sufficient for thee."
The imagery is just fantastic. It exposes the root of our worry. It shows us that the size of our thorn or our need, which feels so massive and overwhelming to us that it blocks out the sun, is actually infinitesimally small when placed next to the infinite, boundless reservoir of God's grace. Our anxiety usually comes from simply miscalculating the sheer scale of the giver.
That is a perfect transition to another historical analogy, this one from the 12th century leader Bernard of Clairvaux. He offered a profound distinction for anyone who feels exhausted, burned out, or depleted by life and ministry. He contrasted living as a canal versus living as a reservoir.
A canal versus a reservoir. I've actually heard this mentioned in leadership circles. Tell us how he explained it.
Think about the architectural design of a canal. A canal is engineered to pour out every single drop of water it receives the very moment it receives it. It is a conduit of rapid, immediate transfer.
Water comes in, water goes straight out.
But the inherent danger of a canal is this. If the intake of water from the source slows down even slightly, the canal instantly becomes dry, cracked, and totally empty.
Because it has no reserves.
Clairvaux noted that many people live their lives, their parenting, and even their spiritual ministries exactly like canals. They attempt to constantly give out energy, love, and resources to others before they have allowed themselves to be totally permeated and filled by God's grace.
And what's the result of that?
This inevitably universally leads to severe burnout, resentment, and spiritual depletion.
Because they're frantically trying to give away water they don't actually have enough of yet. They are running on empty. But a reservoir is fundamentally different.
Yes. A reservoir is designed with a completely different philosophy. It is designed to retain the water until it's filled entirely to the brim. It allows itself to be filled first. Only then, once it is overflowing its banks, does it gently discharge the excess water to the valley below.
And it gives only from its overflow, meaning it never experiences a loss to its own internal fullness.
Exactly. Sufficient grace is the ongoing process by which God fills the reservoir of your heart. When you allow God to keep you filled to overflowing, you bless the world from a position of divine fullness, peace, and rest, rather than from a place of managed meagerness and frantic anxiety.
And often the painful thorn in our life is the very explosive tool God uses to dig the reservoir deeper, expanding our capacity to hold more of His grace.
That reframes suffering so beautifully. A deeper reservoir holds more grace.
Let's look at a more modern illustration to wrap up these analogies. The rising tide, or the story of the sunken ship. This is from the era of great American engineering. When engineers were attempting to build a massive bridge over New York's East River, they ran into a major catastrophic problem.
The sunken ship in the mud.
Yes. They discovered a huge, heavy, sunken metal ship buried deep in the thick mud at the bottom of the river in the exact precise location where the central foundational pier of the bridge needed to be placed.
So what did they do?
The initial human response, naturally, was to apply massive mechanical force. They brought in huge barges equipped with powerful cranes to try and yank the ship out of the mud by sheer strength. They fired up the engines and pulled.
Using willpower, basically.
Right. But the suction of the mud and the immense weight of the water were too much. The thick steel cables violently snapped under the tension, and the ship remained entirely stuck. Willpower and mechanical strength completely failed.
It wasn't enough.
But then one engineer proposed a completely different approach. It wasn't about fighting harder, it was about leveraging a far greater power. At low tide, they took incredibly strong cables and attached them securely to the hull of the sunken ship and fastened the other ends tightly to a large buoyant barge floating on the surface.
Okay, so they were connected.
They didn't turn on a single engine, they didn't pull with any cranes, they simply attached the cables tightly and waited.
They waited for the Atlantic Ocean.
Yes. As the tide naturally inevitably came in, the silent, relentless, and unimaginably massive power of the ocean began to lift the floating barge. And as the barge rose inch by inch, it effortlessly, silently pulled the massive sunken ship completely free from the mud.
This is a masterful illustration of the difference between human willpower represented by the snapping cranes and grinding engines, and God power represented by the unstoppable rising tide.
We all have sunken ships in our lives, don't we? Deep, complicated grief, stubborn, heavy addictions, chronic, exhausting illness, things we desperately try to pull out of the mud with the cranes of our own willpower, our own self-help books, our own strict diets, and we just end up snapping our cables and feeling exhausted and defeated.
Sustaining grace is that quiet, gentle, unstoppable strength of the rising tide. It lifts us when we are fundamentally physically incapable of lifting ourselves.
It is the power of the universe acting on our behalf. Let us consider one final illustration before we look at specific biblical figures. The King's Banquet.
The concept of a banquet hall is a very frequent biblical metaphor for the kingdom of God and the lived experience of His grace.
In the famous parable of the wedding banquet, Jesus describes a king who prepares an incredibly magnificent feast for his son.
The king spares absolutely no expense. He utilizes all the vast, limitless resources of his kingdom to prepare the finest roasted meats, the most beautiful music, and the most elegant decorations.
He sets a beautiful, extravagant table, and naturally he sends out invitations to all the VIPs of the land. But what happens? They all make ridiculous excuses.
They prioritize their businesses, their newly bought land, their families, over the king's incredibly generous invitation. They insult him by refusing to come.
In response to this rejection, the king does something culturally shocking for the ancient world. He commands his servants to go out into the highways and hedges the literal dirt roads and outskirts of society, and to aggressively bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.
He bypasses the elite and invites the absolute outcasts.
This illustration clarifies something so important about the nature of grace. Grace is an inclusive, sweeping call to salvation that is extended specifically to those who are fundamentally unworthy in the eyes of the world.
And the king doesn't just say, come in and look at the food from the corner. His grace is sufficient to not only provide the extravagant meal, but in the context of ancient customs, to provide the necessary, clean wedding garment of righteousness required to actually sit at the table and stay in the hall.
The banquet hall represents a permanent state of fellowship, joy, and peace with God. And the crucial theological point is that it is entirely prepared, funded, and sustained by the king. The guests bring absolutely nothing to the table except their hunger.
The only requirement for the guest is to humbly accept the invitation and wear the garment provided.
It's all provided. What a relief. Now, as we round out our deep dive discussion today, let's seamlessly weave in some actual historical Bible story examples. We want to see this specific grace in the narrative of real people's lives, not just in parables or analogies.
Let's start way back in Genesis with Noah.
Noah, let's talk about him.
Noah is a fascinating, often misunderstood study in sustaining grace. He lived in an ancient society characterized by total, pervasive, and violent moral decay. Against all cultural norms, he spent 120 years engaging in the seemingly absurd, monumental task of building a massive wooden ark on dry land.
He faced decades of intense public mockery, isolation, and immense physical exhaustion.
He survived this century-long ordeal not because he was a superhuman stoic with iron willpower, but because, as the text explicitly states in Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, he found favor, which is translated as grace in the eyes of the Lord.
Grace was the invisible engine that provided the quiet power for him to simply keep on swinging the hammer day after day, decade after decade.
Just faithful, plodding endurance, fueled entirely by grace.
Then moving forward, we have Abraham and Sarah. They are known as the father and mother of faith, right? But if you actually read their story, it is a story of grace overcoming unbelief. They were given a spectacular, impossible promise of a son in their extreme old age, but they struggled deeply with doubt. Sarah actually laughed out loud at God's timeline.
They had what we might call a very skinny introduction to faith. They made massive moral mistakes. They repeatedly tried to force God's hand by using Hagar. They lapsed in their trust and lied to foreign kings to save their own skin.
Yet, despite their repeated human frailty, their bad decisions, and their moments of profound unbelief, God's grace remained entirely sufficient to fulfill the covenant he had originally made with them.
His faithfulness completely superseded their weakness.
He didn't abandon them when they messed up the plan. And what about Rahab in the book of Joshua? Her story is the ultimate undeniable example of grace for the outsider.
Rahab was a Canaanite, a sworn enemy of Israel. She was a prostitute living in the city wall. By every single social, moral, and religious standard of her day and ours, she was deemed entirely unworthy of God's grace or attention.
Yet, because she possessed a simple, trembling belief in the rumors of God's power and acted on that rudimentary belief by hiding the Israelite spies, she was graciously, miraculously spared from the violent destruction of Jericho.
And the grace didn't stop at mere survival. It elevated her to be included in the very family lineage of Jesus Christ. It is a stunning, undeniable historical testimony to the fact that grace absolutely does not check a moral resume before it acts.
No resume required, just an open hand. And finally, let's look at the New Testament with Peter. This is the profound grace of restoration. Peter was one of Jesus' closest, most fiercely loyal friends. He swore he would die for him.
Yet in Jesus' darkest, most terrifying hour, Peter violently and publicly denied even knowing him, not once, but 3 times, even calling down curses on himself. You can imagine the crushing, suffocating guilt Peter felt when the rooster crowed. He was completely broken.
But after the resurrection, we see that incredibly tender, quiet scene on the beach in John chapter 21. Jesus does not scold him. Jesus specifically seeks out. Peter prepares a warm breakfast of fish over a charcoal fire for him, and gently, methodically restores him to his pastoral calling.
asking 3 times if Peter loves him to counteract the 3 denials. It proves definitively that God's sufficient grace is vast enough to cover, heal, and completely redeem even our most shameful public and agonizing failures. Peter's moment of greatest weakness actually became the foundational platform for his greatest pastoral strength as a leader in the early church.
What an incredible expansive journey we have been on today. We have covered so much ground from ancient Greek vocabulary to modern engineering, and I want to just warmly summarize the heart of what we've discovered for you, our listener. We have learned that sometimes God's no to our desperate prayers is actually a yes to something infinitely better and deeper. We've seen that your weakness, your failure, your physical frailty, none of it is a disqualification from being loved and used by God. In fact, it makes you the absolute perfect emptied candidate for His power to shine through. Those agonizing thorns in your flesh, those painful struggles you carry every day, they are not dead ends. They are doorways. They empty you out so that you can be filled with the quiet, gentle, unstoppable power of the rising tide of God's grace.
That is so true.
To you listening right now, whether you are a newcomer or a mature believer, I want to earnestly thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I want to warmly encourage you in your ongoing walk with Christ. Please remember this above all else today. You do not have to be good enough on your own. You never, ever had to be. Let the strong hands of the Father cover your struggling, tired hands.
I want to add a grounded, serious, yet deeply comforting encouragement as we close our time together. The biblical texts emphasize that in the latter days, in times of great cultural confusion and shifting moral truths, it is absolutely vital for believers to adhere strictly and uncompromisingly to the pure Word of God.
Amen to that.
We see throughout the Scriptures a call to reject the empty traditions and the manufactured legalistic doctrines of men, the very traditions of earned favor and outward religious performance, which the Lord Jesus so deeply opposed during his earthly ministry. True, sustaining, life-giving grace is found exclusively in His pure, unadulterated Word. Anchor yourself firmly to that truth, and you will not be moved by the chaotic storms of this age.
Anchor yourself to the pure Word. I love that. As we finally wrap up this incredible conversation, I want to leave you, our listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over and explore on your own this week. We've talked extensively about how thorns expand our capacity to hold God's goodness.
We have.
So ask yourself this. If God is currently saying no to removing a painful thorn in your life right now, what unseen beautiful reservoir is He's secretly expanding inside you at this very moment. Thank you for being part of this conversation. We will see you next time.